Well, good. Actually, it's Happy New Year. The holiday has come and gone, I guess, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Right.
That's right. We have a lot to talk about today. So Happy New Year, the first episode, 2025. Thaddeus Bouchard from Screendollars and Mike Polydorus.
Thank you, Paul.
For Airplane, and me, Paul DeGarabedian from ComScore. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on one of the podcast platforms, we're happy to see you and hear you in 2025. We have a lot to talk about, don't we, boys?
Oh, we do.
We do. We've got 365 days ahead of us, or almost 360 days ahead of us, maybe something like that. So,
well, it feel like 365 anyway. So
it was an interesting holiday period at the box office, and Paul, Thaddeus, it played out pretty much like we kind of laid it out. I think on our last episode, we went through and we kind of, I think, Paul, 8.75 billion is where we kept saying.
I have the actual number, Mike.
We have an official number now?
We have an official number now. So this just in. Put in the 8.741 billion in reported ComScore numbers for the calendar year of 24. That's down 3.4%. We had estimated 8.75. I think coming in at 8.74. That's pretty damn close. So I'm happy with that. I think Mike and Thaddeus, as we've talked about for months, to be at a nearly 28% year-over-year deficit back before Inside Out 2 opened, and to wind up at down 3.4% for the full year is pretty amazing, considering the challenges and headwinds that befell the early part of the year due to the strikes and work stoppages. But quite a year for box office. And I took the liberty of putting together, along with my co-hosts, some takeaways for 24 and a look ahead to 25. And we can get to those anytime. We could talk Golden Globes. There's so much to talk about, but whatever you guys want to get into.
I think what would be real interesting, Paul, would be some of the takeaways that you put together.
Okay.
And everyone should know, over the holidays, Paul was extremely busy. I think anybody who was doing their year-end box office story, Paul was the man who was giving the context to the numbers. And it was interesting from a standpoint of going into the holiday period. There were all sorts of different projections that were coming out. Some were higher, some were lower than what it ended up being. But I think, Paul, you did a really good job of contextualizing how the holiday season went together. And I think
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You actually provided, Paul and I were talking last week, and there was an interesting stat you came up. The way the calendar falls determines a lot of what happens in the Christmas period or the holiday period, because when Christmas is on a Friday, it plays out different when Christmas is on a Tuesday, or in this case, Christmas was on a Wednesday. Last time, 2019 was the last time that Christmas fell on a Wednesday, and obviously that was right before the pandemic hit, so it's a very interesting kind of comparison. And Paul, you pulled up some interesting numbers on that.
Yeah, that was kind of cool that the calendar, the way it laid out this year, Mike, you're exactly right. And by the way, I stole something from you, Mike, that I used in the AP, talking about how when the calendric cycle.
Calendric, I like that.
lands as such as it did this year, every day through the holiday at the end of the year was like a Saturday, right? Every day played almost like a Saturday. I borrowed that from you. Well, maybe stole it is a better way to put it. But yeah, so I went back and I looked at from the November 22nd through December 31st, which in both 2024 and 2019, pre-pandemic 2019, laid out exactly the same. So I thought, well, 2019's got to be much bigger. Well, guess what? They were nearly identical, around $1.63 to $1.64 billion for both years. Frozen 2 was the number one movie in that corridor. And both films earned about and I have it here, I don't have it right in front of me, but both films earned in the $430 million range domestically. They were nearly identical. The top movie and the total box office for that 22nd through the 22nd of November through December 31st I don't think anyone would have thought that would have been the case, that no way would a post-pandemic holiday period, but we just had such an amazing array of films. That whole Glicked leading into Moana 2, leading into Sonic and Mufasa, and then those great indie films that came out through that period. It was great.
Well, I think the other thing too, Paul, like I just looked at it and sitting there today, Moana's at 4.25, which is unbelievable. I mean, the movie had very strong legs through the holiday season, and which is kind of, a little surprising considering you had both Mufasa and Sonic in the marketplace at the same time. So you had, 3 family films that were there. And the other thing from 2019 to this year, which is kind of interesting, is 2019 had a Star Wars movie, and we did not have a Star Wars movie this year.
That's right. I have the actual numbers right in front of me. So for that 2019 period with the same calendric configuration, say that 5 times fast, for the period November 22 through December 31 in 2019 generated $1.64 billion, led by Frozen 2 with $430.1 million. This year, $1.633 billion, with Wicked leading the way with $432.9, actually earned more in that period than did Frozen 2. So wow, quite a stat, quite a year. And another one of the big points, Thaddeus, is the watershed year for animation.
Oh, no question about it. Animation really had a bumper crop this year, and family films more generally, but animation specifically. And and all the way through the year too. The first quarter, of course, was notoriously off at the beginning of last year, as it might be a little bit this year as well, although we'll get to that. But animation really kind of carried the year in a lot of different ways. And whereas previously in 2019, what would it have been? Superhero films, probably, right?
Right.
So
that's a good point. I mean, too, the PG rating actually surpassed in total box office for the year PG-13. Thanks, Wicked.
That's great. So much of it is a game about expectations, because we're benchmarking, how we doing against how we used to do. This quarter, whether it was the previous quarter or it was the previous year or it was pre-pandemic. So it's interesting how the game of expectations is so important. But it transcends how everyone in the industry feels. It's like a common currency in the industry is setting expectations. And then do you live up to those expectations or do you not?
That's a good point. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And this, and another one of the things that I put together with some of the ComScore numbers was how important it is to have a Marvel movie to kick off a summer. And this year we have Thunderbolts kicking off. And I'm going in no particular order, but
yes.
I think having Disney back in such a big way and also, doing so well in 2024 is quite amazing. And it wasn't really until Inside Out 2 that Disney had that big hit with for their slate in 2024 and 2025, Captain America coming up on Valentine's.
Well, what's interesting, Paul? I was curious. So I looked at how many films did Disney, not the Fox or 20th Century Searchlight label, but how many films did the Disney label release last year?
The Disney label? 2?
No, it was...
3?
They actually had, I believe it was 4 movies that they released. They had Inside Out 2, they had Deadpool, they had Moana, and they had Mufasa. Those were the 4 movies, and they did $1.7 billion of box office.
I mean, when Disney was out of the equation for a while, when they had those fallow years, it really hurt the entire industry. I mean, we would not be looking at $8.74 billion for 2024, were it not for Disney. And now to have Disney back in such a huge way in this year, and even if you took Marvel out of the equation, just have Mufasa and Inside Out 2 and Moana 2, right there, you've got an incredible trifecta of family films. So that's huge.
You talk about, making your at-bats count. That would be one where you would do it. And then, of course, if you factor in the Searchlight and the Fox label, you had movies like Alien that were in there. You had and I know your favorite movie of the holiday season, A Complete Unknown, which was another one that popped up out of nowhere that, and again, I'm gonna kind of jump around a little
Sure.
bit. Paul, you called this, about a month ahead of time, and this was probably one of the most diversified holiday periods I've seen in a long time. And Nosferatu coming out, which is going to end up doing probably over 100 million when it's all said and
That's
done.
right.
What a stroke of genius from counter programming. That is a movie that I don't think anyone on their bingo cards saw that coming to the level that came to.
And notably, the movie Seven was re-released this past weekend. Another very dark movie that earned over $100 million back then, by the way. So, I mean, audiences like their movies in all shapes and sizes and types. And I think this holiday, I mean, there are so many movies that I still need to see. As you alluded to, I saw A Complete Unknown. I absolutely loved it. It's, of course, right in my wheel. I mean, I almost cried several times. Usually it takes a dog to be in a movie to make me cry. But when Timothée Chalamet, Monica Barbaro, that entire cast was just incredible. I love the movie. I think it's so good. And a lot of people are being turned on to Bob Dylan's music. But Chalamet has just, for me, become like the actor of a generation. I mean, that's thrown around a lot. But I really feel like this gentleman has paid his dues, and working 5 or 6 years on this was really paid off big. He played 40 songs. He could, on each take, he had to do several takes playing guitar, singing. Monica Barbaro also playing Joan Baez, learning to play the guitar and sing. And I want to give a special shout out to Boyd Holbrook, who plays Johnny Cash. And as you recall, he was in Logan. He was kind of the bad guy coming after Logan in that movie, and James Mangold directing both. And he's unrecognizable. I didn't even realize that was Boyd Holbrook. Great actor. Al Fanning's great. Dan Fogler. Can't say enough about the movie. James Mangold, another great movie from him.
Well, you talk about Timothée Chalamet, but think about he was the king of last Christmas season, last holiday season, and he played a whimsical character in Wonka. Couldn't be any, farther from Bob Dylan, and pulls them both off flawlessly. And so, to your point, I mean, you truly are looking at like an actor of a generation, and, not to mention, where he played something in the middle with, kind of Dune too. So, when they talk about range, that's the guy right there.
And for Oscars, I mean, certainly, of course, he's going to be, he's at the top of my list to win, but it's a little early for me to predict. But, and then Edward Norton as Pete Seeger. I mean, you look at Edward Norton in American History X, and then you look at him as Pete Seeger. I mean, talk about range, right? Incredible actors in this. And Mangold has done so many great movies. I mean, Copland is one of my favorites. Ford versus Ferrari. The Indiana Jones movie notwithstanding, but definitely that wasn't on him completely. But what a great body. And Walk the Line with Joaquin Phoenix as Johnny Cash. He also directed that. So Mangold is just kind of unsung hero of cinema in a way. He doesn't get name-checked as much as some of the others, but just great.
Well, back in the day, we worked on one of his movies, one of my favorite Mangold movies, and that was 3:10 to Yuma. And I'll never forget, quick side note, we were getting ready to go to CinemaCon, and we had asked Mangold, can you get us a clip? The movie was still in production, and he sent over like a 12-minute piece, and he said, just let me know out of this what you want to use. And we were riveted to the entire 12 minutes, and we were like, don't change a thing. Just, let's finish this, and this is what we'll take. And that's what we did. It was great.
Love that movie. To have Christian Bale and Russell Crowe.
Ben Foster, too.
Ben Foster steals every movie he's in.
As Ben Foster played the bad guy in that one. And he
very unique bad guy, I will say.
Very unique bad guy. But to your point, he stole the show in that one. But for anyone who hasn't seen 3:10 to Yuma, I suggest that you make that a must-watch.
I agree, Mike. It's a fantastic, and it's a remake, but I would argue it's more enjoyable than the original. I absolutely love that movie. And, Ben Foster, he's so great. He was in Hell or High Water, steals that movie. Although Chris Pine
Another
was great.
one we worked on. You look at that. When Ben Foster is working with us, it's all good for Ben.
That's right.
Right.
And Alpha Dog, that movie was a
That
trip.
one we didn't work on that one.
But if you haven't seen that movie, Nick Cassavetes directing, Bruce Willis, Justin Timberlake, Emile Hirsch, Sharon Stone, Ben Foster, Harry Dean Stanton. It's based on a true story, by the way.
We'll list these movies out in the show notes to the podcast and to the YouTube video, so everyone
I like
can
that
look
idea.
them up.
I want to take a side note real quick here, because when Paul makes a recommendation on a film, I think you need to take it very seriously. A couple of episodes ago, we were talking about some of our best, what I would call the Hallmark Christmas movies, and Paul singled out a movie called
Here we go.
Frosty. And
Here we go. Hot Frosty.
Hot Frosty, about a snowman who comes to life and has a romantic affair with the protagonist. Paul, I read there were 4 different lists that came out and said the Christmas movies you need to watch on Netflix this year. Hot Frosty was at the top of each one of them. So
you can't go wrong.
Paul, you've tapped into Americana there.
And I know, Mike, you're not afraid to say you love those kind of movies, and I appreciate that. I like that.
And that was, there was definitely, although I did do my annual viewing of It's a Wonderful Life.
That's an all-time wonderful, and Die Hard, another great Christmas movie, and Home Alone.
Yes, but the one thing about Die Hard is, when was that released? It's funny you bring that up, because we were talking with a producer just recently, and he has a movie that has some Christmas themes in it, and he's very concerned about the release window because he feels like it needs to be closer to Christmas. We're trying to explain to him that, that's not always the case. And I brought up Die Hard. Do you remember when it was released?
Yeah, so I've got all the numbers in front of me for Die Hard because I'm looking them up.
Do you remember the date, though? What was the original release date of Die Hard?
I show July 15, 88.
That is exactly right. It was a summer action blockbuster. And it really wasn't a blockbuster. What was the final gross of the original release,
Mike,
Paul?
I'm so glad you brought this movie, because these are the things we can highlight during the podcast that, you have to have access to at your fingertips, which I do. So that movie, they didn't know what they had. I mean, it was Bruce Willis. He was a TV guy, and people were kind of scoffing at that. The movie opened in 21 theaters. The opening day gross was $176,000. The opening weekend was $601,851. It didn't go wide till later. It has check out the opening weekend multiple for Die Hard, 134.
Yeah. What was the final? Do you have the final run?
Yeah,
there?
the final domestic unadjusted, $81.35 million.
So it's very similar to something like the original Austin Powers, which found a life in, at that point, what we would call home video afterwards, and really built a franchise. And everybody kind of looks back on the original quite, a little bit with rose-colored glasses, because it didn't do what everybody thinks it did.
Yeah. Well, on that movie, I remember seeing the very first Austin Power. I was working in the Pacific Theaters building, and New Line was in that building, and they built a screening room in the lobby area, and went in there, and they showed us the original Austin Powers International Man of Mystery. And I was just blown away. It was so funny. And being a James Bond fan and all that, Matt Helm and all those classic spy movies, it was so great. But, the second film earned more in its opening weekend than the first Austin Powers earned in its entire run.
Well, so what I remember about the first Austin Powers, and this is back when we used to have Show West before it was CinemaCon. And Show West was, I believe we were at Bally's or we were at Harrods for this one. And New Line at the time was hosting a lunch, and everything was Austin Powers themed. But remember, no one had seen the movie yet. This was before the movie had come out. So Mike Myers comes out and he's dressed in the Austin Power garb. And he's doing the "yeah, baby" thing. That entire room was looking at him like, what the hell is this? The dinner or the lunches were in, giant, TV dinner trays and everything like that. It was all retro 60s.
I remember that. That was cool.
But I also remember the entire room just looking around Paul like,
nobody got it.
No one got, now if they would have done that the following year, it would have been a home run, can't miss. But it just goes to show you, like, sometimes you need to understand the context of what you're being, kind of pitched on. And in this case, no one knew.
And that movie, the second one did so well because the first movie blew up on home video.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And so check it out. So the final domestic unadjusted cum for Austin Powers' International Man Mystery that opened May 2nd, 1997 was $54 million.
And again, you'd lose your shirt in a bet on that one.
Right. And that's a 5.66 multiple for those keeping track of multiples at home. And then 2 years later, June 11, 1999, Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me opened to $54.9 million. And again, the first film earned in total $54 million. It's really interesting, really unusual.
Well, if you want to look at a more recent example of that, look at the John Wick franchise. And again,
built over time.
A one that I'm very familiar with, that we worked very, very closely on.
When you say we worked on, Mike, tell the audience what you mean.
So at the time I was at Lionsgate, and John Wick was what we would call a pickup. The movie had been made. A movie was screened for an acquisition screening, meaning that it was available for any studio to put an offer in. We screened it at the AMC Century City. And at this point in Keanu Reeves' career, he was really doing direct-to-video stuff, if you might remember. And we screened the movie, and Lionsgate at the time had a history of doing well with what I would call the Jason Statham action movies. We would put those out. There was an audience for them. They would do anywhere from $18 to $20 million. And, they were a nice piece of business that you would put into your ancillaries. We screened the movie, and I'll never forget when the screening was over, the head of acquisitions came up to me. I was the distribution person that was there, and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, it reminds me very much of a Jason Statham movie with Keanu Reeves in the role of Jason Statham." And so Jason Constantine, the acquisition exec, said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, given that, it probably does $18 to $20 million would be my guess." And we had a meeting the next, and this just goes to show you, like, when you are nimble and you can move quickly. We had a meeting the next day. David Spitz, who was the president of distribution at the time, had realized that Kingsman had moved off of the October date. And based on the way the Lionsgate schedule was at that time, that was the only date we had available for the entire next 12 months that we could put this movie in. Now, the rub was, this was the last week of July. So you were talking about 8 weeks from the time we saw the movie to the time that we'd have to be in theaters. And we all sat around a table, and the international team said, "We can do it." The marketing team said, "We can do it." The producers were like, "This is great. We want to do it." We walked out of there with a release date and a game plan. And, anyone who says that they knew it was going to be a multi-billion-dollar franchise is, kind of stretching the truth a little bit. We went out. Movie did not do $20 million. It did $42 million, I believe, is what the
You're right there, Mike. 43 million, man.
And then it was another movie that had a tremendous life on ancillaries.
From Mike, and on home video, that's where I actually saw the first one, John Wick Chapter 2, which came out about 2.5 years later, doubled that opening weekend of 14.4 million. And each successive John Wick movie, all released by Lionsgate, made more on the opening weekend, made more on the domestic. I'm looking at it now in the ComScore data. Each one bested the previous one, although the movies got a lot longer. The first movie was 1 hour and 36 minutes. And for reference, John Wick Chapter 4, drum roll, please.
Seems like everything is 2.5 hours these days, right? So
that was a long, that
2
was
hours and 49 minutes.
Yep, right. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great story, and it's a great just kind of way that it all kind of came together. And I'm really proud of all the work we did on that, and that first movie, just setting it up so that it was able to do what it did. And then, when we got to the second movie and you started seeing the production value increase and what it was, and, the director, Chad Stahelski, who is Keanu's stunt coordinator on the Matrix movies, they got together and put this thing together. And Chad was really interesting in talking about how he choreographs these things, and, had a couple of conversations with him. And it was just fascinating how, it's almost like, he is a fan of the ballet, which Ballerina is the spinoff with Ana de Armas coming up. He choreographs his fight scenes very much like dance, and which enables him to do camera shots that no one else can do. And it's a really, it's a really cool look that he's able to do, which makes it very unique, which makes that what the fans have come to expect from the Wick series. But this goes all the way back to what we started about, and that is, you sometimes these films will get you look back at them and think, of course, it was huge to start with. And, whether it was Die Hard or Austin Powers or John Wick, not always the case.
Well, there's a big topic in the industry, obviously, which is the prevalence of sequels and franchises. And, these are all examples of original films that were not much was expected of them. But it started a phenomenon, Austin Powers or John Wick. And, it's interesting. Another film that comes to mind that's over the last 8 weeks is Moana 2, of course, is a sequel to Moana. Moana didn't do fabulously, certainly not Moana 2 numbers when it came out, but it became a streaming phenomenon. It was one of the most popular films streamed over the last 4 years, and it sort of set the stage for Moana 2 to have such success, which comes to another point, which is this sort of relationship between streaming, we talked about this, I think, last time, and theatrical, and how they really are complementary. 20 years ago, it was home video we were talking about, which allows a buzz gradually to build over time. But I think streaming allows for, if there is a connection between what's streaming and what's going to be available in theaters, to sort of...
that's a really good segue. When you look at the holiday period, and I think we brought this up the last time, between Moana and Red One, which were both movies that were, when they were greenlit, those were going direct to platform, as they say. So you're looking at, Paul, what is that, $525 million a box that ended up going, or close to that, we'll call it 515, that ended up, going to theatrical, which helped to get us to that 8.74 billion. And again, the content holders, whether it was Disney or Amazon MGM, looked at it and felt it was important to take the right turn to theatrical, because that was going to add to the value of the IP. And clearly, that has done that with both. I'm sure Moana 3 is well on its way, and there's probably a sequel to Red One that's being worked on as well. But you talk about the relationship. There were a couple of movies this year that ended up going PVOD on New Year's Eve, and that was Gladiator 2 and Wicked, and both were still having strong theatrical runs. Both go to PVOD with a $29.99 to buy, $19 rent, and for the most part, PVOD has zero effect. And PVOD, just so everybody knows, that we talk about, is the premium video on demand, meaning it's not part of your Netflix subscription or your Max subscription or Paramount Plus. It's something you need to go out and spend some money on.
And Mike, if a rental is over $20, I'm not doing it. I'm just...
I think that's the point, Paul. The point being that those have very little effect on theatrical. They just do. It's just, they're additive. It's almost like the guy who's going to, to your point, who's going to spend $20 to rent it or $29 to own it, was never coming to the movie theater in the first place. And that is... there was a lot of, because Wicked was doing what Wicked was doing, there was definitely a little bit of a rub in the world of exhibition and distribution that you're going too soon. But at the end of the day, you all need to remember it's a business, and everybody's trying to maximize, on their own area of what
those
revenue.
Movies. The fear of now, a too short of window will never work. Okay. No. But the industry never wanted to let the genie out of the bottle and shorten it from 3 months. And turns out these movies can survive and even thrive, like you just pointed out, even if they're available at home, especially on PVOD. And Moana, the first film, was being pushed big time on Disney Plus with all kinds of promotional materials for Moana 2. And so that kids at home and families at home watching Disney Plus are like, we got to go to the movie theater right now. So they're bouncing back and forth between the theater. Like you said, Thaddeus, it's additive, it's complementary. Don't fear the Reaper, so to speak. Don't fear the.
Well,
Yeah,
I think it's really
our soundtrack on that one. I think I'll look around over my shoulder here.
I think it's really important that, between, PVOD, SVOD, which is streaming video on demand, and theatrical, all find that symbiotic relationship so that, because they all need each other to survive, and it all, one is good for the other, that's good for the other. And I think that, to me, is a something that post-pandemic, and again, we're coming up on 5 years, so I don't know how much longer I can say post-pandemic, but it is something that I think we can, it's finding its way. I think, the public has come to kind of settle into what it is. And,
Well, Mike, that's it. That we got to give the audience credit too, right? The fact that we're like, wow, Nosferatu could be $100 million movie. Excuse me, I'm all choked up. Been talking too much lately, as you guys know. No, I think you got to give the audience credit because they came out for Nosferatu, and in 70 millimeter too. And at the Golden Globes, the director, The Brutalist, was saying on paper, a 3.5-hour movie like The Brutalist in 70 mil, that's not, now, by the way, it's not trying to be a blockbuster, but it's turned into a cinematic phenomenon that people who are in the know really want to see, and especially in 70 millimeter.
Well, I think it's, and I know we're coming up on time. We got to wrap up soon here, but I got 2 more points I want to kind of do. And the first one is, we bring up a really good point, Thaddeus, and you talked about the sequels, and you talked about there needs to be a mix when it comes to the films, and you can't just take the safe route out and always go with the sequel. The new franchise has to get launched somewhere. And, the hardest thing to do, and I can tell you this from working at a studio for 23 years, and that is when you go in thinking I'm going to launch a franchise, that usually is not a really good recipe. What really happens is I've got a great piece of IP, whether it's John Wick, whether it's Austin Powers, whether it's Die Hard, and that on its own is going to spawn whatever it is. But somebody needs to take a chance on whatever that, new IP is going to be. So you have to have the new IP mixed with the sequels and, all of that. And that leads to my point. Well, the one, I'm going to raise my hand with one concerning issue, and that is, I'm going to use the word again, post-pandemic, we're probably looking at around 725 million admissions to box office compared to about 1 billion pre-pandemic. We got to get those people back. We got to find a way to make the offering appealing to get those people to come back to the movies. That, to me, is a very key issue. NATO is being very serious about this. They have a campaign this year called At the Movies that once a quarter is going to do, is working on initiatives to stimulate movie going, as opposed to like the old cinema day that they did a couple of years in a row. This is more of an ongoing thing, and I think it's a really smart thing to do. So I while theatrical isn't going anywhere, and we're all looking at what we're looking at, and I think we all agree with that. We also need to be realistic in that, there are things we need to do to kind of shore up the movie-going experience.
Hey, Mike, you actually inspired me to look at my top 25 of 2024 and go through and how many sequels there are in the top 25 domestic. And wow, man, Inside Out in the top 10, only Wicked is not a sequel. Not yet. I mean, the next one will be. And then in the top 15, there's only 2 out of those. So I'll go through really fast, but like Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, Moana 2, Despicable Me 4, Beetlejuice, Dune Part 2, Twisters, Godzilla X Kong, which I guess that's part of the Godzilla franchise.
Yeah, franchise, right.
Kung Fu Panda 4, Bad Boys Ride or Die, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, known brand. Gladiator 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Venom the Last Dance, Quiet Place Day 1, Mufasa, The Lion King, not a Lion King
still part of
film.
Yes.
Ghostbusters, Frozen Empire, Alien Romulus, and then the bottom 3 of the top 25 are not sequels. But yeah, pretty interesting. But you're right. They have to start somewhere. And eventually, a movie that does well, if you don't mess it up, you can create an entire world out of that. So yeah, pretty cool, but very sequelized. I think we've talked about this too on the podcast. In the indie world, people like originality, but it seems like in the blockbuster world, especially if you're a family and you're going to pay for 5 tickets plus concessions, kind of want to know the kids, and I don't have kids, but I mean, kind of want to know the kids are going to have a good time and you're going to enjoy the movie.
Well, I think the other thing that goes with it too is, having, again, worked on the studio side, sequels are sometimes the safer bet. In other words, I can put pen to paper and I can tell you, I can do a model and tell you what I think this is going to gross. Much harder to do with a non-sequel. I can tell you, a couple of times where, we sat there agonizing over movies like La La Land. Here is a movie that, it's a musical. Guy does not end up with the girl. What do you comp that to? How do you model that thing out? My famous line on that one, I'll never forget. Eric Feig, who was the head of production, walked into David Spitz's office. We were sitting there. He explains the whole movie to us. We're all like, it sounds great. He walks out, and I looked at the guys and I said, well, that one's either really going to work or it's not. And that one, that actually became the mantra for the movie. Like, Feig came back to me, a couple months later, and he goes, I love that. I love that you said that.
Great.
But the point being is, those are much bigger swings when you do something like
and
that.
Mike, Thaddeus, that's why you got to give a lot of credit to the Neons, the A24 Searchlight Focus, because if you look like, Terrifier 3, of course, was a sequel. Let's not forget that. But, a movie like Longlegs in the horror genre, Maxine, Nosferatu, A Complete Unknown, Baby Girl, The Brutalist, name off any Conclave. These movies from the indie world that actually all of them have done very well, at least with critics. And oftentimes, and the budget on The Brutalist is shockingly low compared to the production value of it. But you're right. Both of you are correct on that. It's really interesting, the swings you have to take and the fear of putting all that money on the line, and whether it works or not is really up to the marketing, the release date, and the audience.
And it goes back to something, and I know we really have to wrap up now, but the one thing I would say is never forget, at the end of the day, it's still a business. And the people who are writing the checks need to be able to justify that they're going to be able to get their investment out of this.
But it's a business that's sort of rife with dreamers at the same time, too. So there's a business context, but there's lots of big swings that happen as well, right?
Thaddeus, that's a whole episode in itself. And I tell you some stories on that.
And then the two movies I want to throw in here are Barbie and Oppenheimer. We don't have to go back too far to a couple original, Barbie, I guess, is derived from Barbie the toy, but, that's not that far in the rearview mirror.
No, those are both original. Yeah. I would say, the idea that you're going to make a huge investment based on a doll, that took some
other than Chucky
guts. Right.
Yeah, right. Other than Chucky, that's right. With that, Thaddeus, we should probably wrap up the new year.
I don't want to end this, guys. I want to keep going. Let's carry our phones with us and be live and
we'll keep it fresh.
Live streaming every minute of this stuff.
We'll keep it fresh. We'll keep the ride going. Ticket to Ride. We're just going to keep it going. Right. There you go.
Well, I want to do a little housekeeping here for our audience. We're going to be doing this on we promise we will not go to Show East this year and say, hey, we had one podcast this year. And I know Thaddeus and his team are really doing some great work. We're going to have, check YouTube and we'll put that up with this episode where you can go to the links and all that. We're going to build this over time, but we're going to be a lot more consistent with the output of what we have, both video and audio. If you want to look at us, you can. If you don't want to, you can just listen. I think it's great. So, we're not here without you and without exhibitors, distributors, all the people that we work with. So, Mike Polydorus, Paper Airplane, Thaddeus Bouchard, Screendollars, Paul DeGarabedian, ComScore. We're happy to keep bringing you this great content.
Well, have a good one, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.
See you in a couple weeks.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't